I've had a lot of families come to me who ended up having to withdraw their child from school completely because the school hasn't been
It's
able
on
to
the
meet them.
rise, isn't it? Thousands. The
Yeah,
numbers are huge at the minute.
there's a good number that I've met who have been traumatized. It's
A
probably
lot of school
the
trauma.
most apt way of describing it. And it's been really interesting working with them. I really enjoy working with them. A lot of children who are autistic are struggling with school, and school's meeting their needs.
Hello, my name's Jenna. I'm an online primary tutor, and today I'm talking to Joanna from Great Expectations about how to quit teaching as an English teacher and become a tutor. If you are a tutor watching this video, let me know in the comments down below. Thank you very much for joining me today, Joanna. It's lovely to have you.
Hi, thank you.
Before we go on to your tutoring journey, let's talk about your teaching journey. So can you explain what is a secondary English teacher, please?
So in my case, I was teaching students from year 7 to year 13. So I was in a full mainstream secondary. And we, obviously for Key Stage 3, worked our way through the national curriculum. And then at GCSE, we had 2 GCSEs to teach. So we had language and literature. And then at A-level, I worked in quite a large school, so we offered quite a few A-levels. We had media studies, film studies, English literature and language, and then I was sort of responsible at one point for introducing English language A-level as well, and also at one point the International Baccalaureate. So it was varied.
Yes, definitely. And how did you find managing the workload with that role? Because obviously that's a lot of content that you had to cover and manage and plan and mark and all that kind of thing.
I mean, I finished teaching in a secondary in 2012, so a lot's changed since then.
Yeah.
And I didn't have any children, which had a big impact probably on my workload. I really loved it. It was hard to start with in terms of teaching literature, because I have a linguistics degree, so linguistics with English language, and so suddenly had to start teaching literature, but was fortunate to have a head of department who had a very much gung-ho attitude. So when I was first given the job, I'd been turned down from a few jobs because I didn't have a literature background, and got the job in the school I was in for 9 years, and had my first timetable come through the post, as they did at that point. And I phoned my to-be head of department to say, "You've put me on literature A-level. I think there's a mistake." He's like, "Oh no, you'll be fine. You'll be fine. There's study guides. You know how to teach, so you'll just figure out." I loved it. Absolutely loved it, and ended up introducing the International Baccalaureates to the English component to the department, and that was wholly literature. So I'd been completely converted by that point. So yeah.
Often you are in teaching just thrown into something and you don't really have a time to think about it at all. So, and you're like, why am I making me do this?
I was thrown into media GCSE at one point, which I didn't quite enjoy as much. But whereas literature, yeah, loved it.
And what was the process to become a secondary English teacher? What did that involve? How did you go about it?
So I did a degree at Bangor, so linguistics with English language, although I don't speak any languages, it's just the study of language. And then I applied for the PGCE at Bangor. So I trained in Wales, where the curriculum is ever so slightly different, I think more so now than it was then. So I had a year of 2 teaching practices at that point, 2 different schools. And it was university based, and we did have chunks of time back at the university with our tutor. And yeah, it was quite straightforward really as as a sort of a 20-year-old. So
And do you think if you were to go back in time, would you do that route again, or would you choose something different?
I would, yeah, the same route. I don't know what the training there is like at the moment, but I really enjoyed it. I had a great tutor. I
Yeah.
happen to have a tutor who's passionate about teaching dyslexic students. Um,
Oh,
as the English secondary tutor, I find now, speaking to primary teachers and secondary teachers, that the training for dyslexia is very minimal in the
mm,
universities, which wasn't my experience because my tutor was very passionate about it, but she was the mother of someone who had dyslexia, so for her it was really important. So I had sort of that right from the start. My husband is dyslexic, so my interest was in dyslexia as well, to understand how it all worked.
oh,
So it was good. She's probably retired now, but
oh.
she was a good tutor.
I was actually talking to another tutor recently about dyslexia, and there isn't really much training on it, like you say, in teaching programs.
Yeah.
It often comes from a personal situation where
Mm.
people look into it because of the personal situation, which is a shame,
Yeah.
really, because there's so many children needing that support, and teachers are going in kind of blind and not
Yeah. And
really knowing how to
seems
support
to
them.
be they get a matter of a couple of hours of training. I gave I've got 4 children and one of them's dyslexic. And after I had pointed out a few discrepancies in their teaching, the Senko, who I got on very well with, invited me in to lead some training for the staff,
Oh,
rather
wow.
than having to relay my um, criticisms. Um, so when I asked her what kind of training they needed, other than things I'd observed, um, she said basically assume they don't really have anything because there's so
Oh.
minimal in the
And that's
university.
really sad, actually, because not only does it impact the teacher, but it impacts the children at the end of the
So
day.
much so, so much so.
Yeah.
Even little things like don't mark 20 spellings in a piece of writing for a 9-year-old, just
Mm,
restrict it to 3.
mm,
Um, that seemingly unknown to some teachers. So
mm.
yeah, there's a huge amount that needs to be done
Yeah,
um,
definitely.
to raise
So,
awareness.
so for the process of getting an English teaching job, what did that involve? So did you have to do an interview, an observation? Was there anything else that surprised you about when you were applying for English teaching jobs?
This was 2003, so my first job was in a school in Nottingham. So I worked there for a year before we relocated. I can't remember whether I was observed teaching. I don't think I was.
Oh, well, you
It
were
was a bit of
lucky.
a bizarre experience. I remember having an interview. I'm not convinced I was observed teaching.
Oh,
And then when I moved to the school I worked at in Cheltenham, um, I had a lesson observation. I think I had a brief meeting with the to-be head of department, and then an interview with the head and the deputy, and I think the former head of English as well, who was at that point had joined the SLT team. Um, and that was one of I'd had a few interviews, as I said, because I didn't have the lit background. So I'd had a couple of interviews elsewhere, and those interviews were the ones where all of the candidates had to wait in the staff room, and then they'd draw you through, and you'd know who had got the job by which member of the team invited you into a room. So obviously the person they're appointing was brought through to the head teacher. Um, but the school I did get a job in, they sent us all away, and phoned later. So I had the phone call on the train going back to Nottingham.
because that used
Um,
to be the way, didn't it? You'd find out on the day and in
yeah,
front of everyone. And that, like, if you didn't get the job, that must be
that's
humiliating.
yeah. So yeah, I see liked this school I did get a job in because we didn't have to sit and wait. And
Yeah, I
I
think
remember
that's more the
being on the
norm
train,
now.
having the job, being offered the job, and then having a phone call from another head teacher offering me an interview and being able to say, just been offered a job, literally, in the last minute or two. So yeah, and that was in Cheltenham, and we loved living in Cheltenham. It's great.
Mm. Now, teaching jobs can be relentless in terms of getting a job. What advice would you give to people that are looking for teaching jobs at the minute?
I'm not too sure what the situation is. I'm a primary school governor,
Oh,
and I know that application we haven't advertised any this year, but I know that applications can be quite low. I think my advice would be to try to go around the school before the interview, and to get a sense of the style of leadership in the school
mm,
and the priorities of the leadership,
mm,
and also to get a sense of the teaching ethos.
mm,
Do the teachers really care about the kids, or are they so exhausted by the current sort of
mm,
educational priorities that they haven't got the spare energy um, to do that? And sometimes that can be influenced by by SLT. The head teacher who I worked for about, well, I was in the school for 9 years, but the first head teacher I worked for was there for 4 or 5, and I remember when he left to retire, and he gathered us together as a staff on the last day and said there have been many government initiatives that you've been unaware of because they've gone into my inbox. So I put them in a pile, ignored them for a couple of months, and then I've put them in the recycling because no one seems to be interested in them. And he was warning us that potentially the person who took over from us would not have the same attitude. But I think sometimes that is
mm.
important in leadership, to protect the staff.
Yeah, I think because as we know, education changes so
Mm.
much, and you're trying to be doing one thing, and then all of a sudden they're like, oh no, let's move on
Yeah.
to this now, even though it's a carbon copy of what we did 2 years ago.
And
So,
then
oh, the workload of a head teacher is insane to keep
mhm,
keep the staff morale up in a
yes,
time where
balance.
everything's coming at them, which is very difficult.
Yeah.
So obviously you've talked about your time as an English teacher, but overall, when you look back on your English teaching career,
Mm.
what would you have to say about it? Overall, a positive experience? You
I
enjoyed
loved
it?
it. Yeah, absolutely loved it. Loved the interactions with students. Um, Being in the class, I was very much a very shy introvert before I went into teaching, so it was a bit of a strange career for me.
Mm,
But I loved the dynamic in the classroom. I I loved planning lessons as well,
mm.
and so marking less so. Um, but yeah, I think it's something potentially I'd like to go back into, but again, it's changed since I was last in the classroom as well.
Mm.
So, but
That's
yeah, I
interesting.
have good memories, positive memories, and still in touch with some of my students. Some of my students having babies makes me feel old. They're only a few years younger than me though. For students from when I was first teaching. So yeah, yeah, that's what 99% positive, I would say.
Ah, now you're the
Um,
first tutor I've spoken to that has said that they would possibly go back, and that's really interesting. So I've spoken to over 20 people now, and you're the
uh-huh.
first one to say. I think people initially, the overall majority have said initially they would have gone back,
Mm,
but once they've gone into their next step, like their tutoring,
yeah.
they haven't really wanted to. But that's lovely that you still got that want in the future if you want to go back,
Yeah, and
keep that door
I miss
open.
the staff room as well, the
Yeah,
having colleagues around to talk to, and um yeah, it wasn't a decision to leave teaching because I didn't enjoy it.
yeah,
It was just circumstances meant that I needed to change how I worked, and I was very fortunate that I just finished my master's in SEN teaching, so I had something that I could um develop. So
ah. Now, for a new English teacher starting out, or even if you were to go back in time, you know, talk to yourself as a younger English teacher, what advice would you give that younger version of you just starting out?
Be organised, I think. my first
Crazy right in teaching, but it's really hard sometimes.
my first year in the school that I had did most of my teaching in, we didn't have enough classrooms for all of the English department. So myself and it was always the new teacher who had to travel around. I must have had like 20 different classrooms, and I was traveling as much as the children. And I had a department board. So, you know, like the old lady shopping trolleys. We had bright blue old lady shopping trolleys that we had to lug around with our laptops and our books and all the stuff. So yeah, the next year I got a classroom, and I was able to be organised. But yeah, I think that's the key thing, because yeah, that was baptism of fire. But equally, I got to know lots of the and going upstairs as well, with 2 stories. It was a 10th elementary school, so it was a big site, and the English department was off in the middle of the field because we were in temporary buildings. But it did mean I got to know lots of staff, and I knew people in different departments because I was teaching in their classrooms. So it had its upsides, but yeah, wasn't ideal.
And that's one thing that primary teachers don't have to deal with, because they're just in their own classroom all the time. You don't have to constantly move.
Yeah.
Is there anything?
And I did feel for the secondary teachers during the pandemic, because so many of them, because of the COVID changes, were having to do what I did in that first year, and they were all having to travel between classrooms, and the students, I think, was in a lot of schools were staying in the classroom while the teachers travelled. And it did bring back memories of my shopping trolley. Yeah.
Now, you briefly mentioned this, but you completed a specialist postgraduate level 7 qualification in dyslexia. What is this, and why did you do it? Which you've kind of spoken about before, but let's go into a bit more detail.
At the time, I didn't know what I was applying for. The sort of the background is my husband is dyslexic, and he was doing a PGCE, and his PGC tutor didn't seem to know much about dyslexia and the way she was supporting him and so forth, which was a surprise to me because my tutor had been so knowledgeable about dyslexia. And his tutor was very willing to take on information that I had gleaned over the years, particularly from my tutor, because the cohort were very sociable. And so I chatted to her quite a bit, but I felt like I needed a qualification to actually sit down with another professional and say, this is what dyslexia is. And one of my colleagues had been doing the local dyslexia course at the University of Gloucestershire the previous year. And so I thought, oh, maybe I'll do that. Didn't really know what I was applying for. Nearly didn't do it because I was about to introduce the English language A level, and so I had a heavier workload the following academic year. But one of my colleagues was chatting to myself and someone who was coming into the school as an NQT, asking what our career aspirations were. And I said, I'm thinking of doing this, but I'm not too sure. And he said, well, do it this year, because if you don't do it this year, there'll always be something that will stop you doing it. So just do it. So I did. So I started the course, didn't really know what a level 7 was, didn't know what a level 5 was. I just was doing the course to learn about dyslexia. And the first year was the dyslexia course. We had, it was for, I don't think it's running at Gloucestershire anymore, but we were doing evenings. So I think it was maybe every other week, going into the university, 3 hours of lectures on a Tuesday evening or something like that. Essays, and then there was a teaching practice of 30 hours or so, usual kind of teaching practice, hands and lesson plans and all that sort of thing. And then we could apply for something called AMDA once we'd finished the course, which is a qualification from the British Dyslexia Association. So I got those qualifications. I continued on the masters. A lot of the people I had trained with were doing the dyslexia module last, and so had been complaining all year that the dyslexia module was the hardest. So
Oh.
I continued on the masters. I did the other modules were very much structure it yourself in terms of topic and so forth, you know, like an overarching theme of teaching and learning, for example. So I looked at how young children learn to read and write, for one. I looked at BLP, Building Learning Power, which is an initiative that was brought into the school that I was teaching in at the time. So I compared that with the learning profile for an international baccalaureate student. And then I did a master's on autism, dissertation on autism. At the time, looking at how the APP, the skills matrix for English, impacts a child who's autistic. It was a case study, so I was sort of working very closely with one of my students and his family. So I did that in 3 years, but it wasn't until I moved to Oxford and started working in a Saturday school that I realised that I had done the more prestigious qualification. So my second week in this Saturday school, I walked in and the person in charge said, I've got someone, I want you to train someone. I was like, I'm not very experienced. You know, I'd done a little bit of tutoring since qualifying, but not a huge amount. She's like, well, you're the only person with a level 7. I was like, oh, okay. Didn't know that was not what all of you did, but they'd all trained at Oxford Brookes, who offered a level 5 at the time, but not a level 7. So the main distinction between a 5 and a 7 is that with a 7 you can diagnose dyslexia, and that you're qualified to use the diagnostic tests. I have not done that since I trained because I love the teaching side.
Okay.
So I don't actually use that part of the qualification, but potentially it gives me a better understanding of the reports that I get from my students, because I can look at the scores and I do understand where those scores have come from, and I try to keep up to date with what the assessors are using and how that all works. And you know, there's recently been a new definition of dyslexia that they're now incorporating into their reports and so forth, and that sort of thing. So yeah.
And how did you manage all that? Like, we're doing a normal teaching job plus all that work. Like, you had to obviously do a block of observations, you said, or a block of lessons for that qualification. Did the school support you then with that? Did you have someone coming into your school to do it?
I worked with a student who was in year 7 at the school, so my teaching with him, I think it was mostly after school. I think I did take him out of a few lessons. He possibly came out of languages because it crossed over with my freeze. It was in the summer when I did the teaching practice, and secondary teachers, if you have a lot of A-level and GCSE students on your timetable, then from June onwards, certainly at that time, you get something called gain time. So you have a lighter timetable. So the teaching practice did correspond with gained time. So I had a bit of a sort of lighter workload, and I think my head of department probably didn't give me too much of a job list because I was doing a teaching practice. But no, the school at the time, there was something called the Teacher Development Agency, the TDA, and so they paid for the masters.
Oh, did
and I
they?
think there was
Wow, that's great.
Yeah, I just had to fill a form in, and I think there was an excess of £500, which my school paid for. So I didn't pay anything for it, which was so glad that colleague pushed me into doing it at the time. Because this was 2006, 2007, so still a Labour government as we're on election day. So they had the TDA and paid for lots of us.
That's really good. That's so
qualifications.
good that you could take that next step.
Yeah. Whereas nowadays, I wouldn't be able to
No
afford it.
funding at all, no.
No.
Nothing at all. And often it's
Very
SEN
expensive.
children that are impacted the most by that lack of funding.
Yeah.
It's really like a lot of children needing to go to particular schools, and there's just not the places, the staff, or
Yeah, and even now there's no priority within the government for specialist teachers to work in schools. So last year, a couple of years ago, I looked at jobs for specialist teachers in schools, and they don't have the funding to pay for specialist teachers, or very few schools have the funding. Some do prioritise that. And so there are groups of us with these qualifications that could be used in schools but aren't used in schools because there's not the funding, or they advertise for maybe a level 5 specialist teacher but pay them on a HTLA rate.
Oh wow.
Which for teachers who've been on EPS
That's a massive dip.
is a dip. Yeah. So
Definitely.
yeah, so it's a yeah. I there was one of there was a government minister who was trying to push. It was the health minister during COVID. Who was that?
Oh, I'm
Can't remember his name.
names. I'm not. I can't
Anyway,
remember
for a
them.
short time, there was a dyslexic government minister who was trying to campaign for more awareness in schools. But
Yeah. I think it's just the lack of knowledge, because when you see things happening with politics, and people at the top just have no clue about children with particular needs. They have no, and they don't seem to want to know more. Whereas other countries, Scandinavian countries, they're very passionate about early years, but they're also passionate about, that whole round education, being right for the individual child. Now, you've told me, obviously, you went on to do the Saturday school, and you used your qualification for that, and you've just talked about your husband. So how did that qualification better help your understanding of supporting your husband and that kind of thing?
Well, so I started at the Saturday school. I think I was after my oldest 2 children had been born. So effectively, I didn't go back to teaching after maternity leave with my first son.
Right.
We'd relocated, although it was within commuting distance, because my husband was training as a vicar. So at the time, he was actually a student, so I was using it, I guess, in terms of helping him proofread and things like that. It's because I had for a short time just before then worked as a university study skills tutor in after school in my spare time as a self-employed. So I'd worked with a couple of uni students who had funding for a study skills tutor, and you needed the dyslexia qualifications to do that. So yeah, so I was using those skills that I'd developed with those students with him.
Oh, wow. That's really good that he could have that specialised support and you had that knowledge. Now, you've also got a support group for parents with children with additional needs. Do you mind sharing about that with me?
Yeah. So my oldest son was born with some difficulties right from the start, really. And when he was 5 months, he was diagnosed with something called Williams syndrome, which is a rare syndrome. Very few people have heard of it. And I, for a couple of years, actually, I didn't learn much about Williams syndrome, deliberately so, because I knew that if I started reading journal articles, I wouldn't get to know him properly, if that makes sense. But we were in Oxford for 3 years. He was born a week after we moved to Oxford.
Right.
Always advisable, relocate just before your child is born. And
always a great tip.
Switch midwife last. Well, my mother was a retired midwife and she wasn't entirely impressed, but needs must. So yeah, so he has Williams syndrome, and we had a couple of years in Oxford. Loved living in Oxford, amazing place to be. Um, Incredible community there. And then we moved to Gloucester, and at the time, so my husband was a curate, so that's kind of a bit like the NQT year for a vicar. And so we were in a church there for 3 years, and at the time there was a parent support group that was growing nationally. It had been started by someone in Cheltenham, and had just blossomed within a matter of months. So I used to go along to some of their meetings, but unfortunately, I could only go now and again because they didn't like children coming to the meetings.
Oh,
And at the time when I first moved there, I had a 3-year-old and a 2-year-old, maybe. There's 18 months between our oldest two. And so a lot of the time I couldn't go. Occasionally I could, but a lot of the time I couldn't. And so that was tricky because I was the parent of a child with additional needs, and there was a group I could go to for support, but I couldn't because they didn't want to have children there. So after the 3 years that we were in that church, we moved for my husband to have a job as a rector in a church in Buckinghamshire, and there was a lady in the church already who had worked as a volunteer in another support group for parents of children with additional needs. So she
oh,
was already in a place to want to support that. And there was another lady as well who had been a parent carer. So we very quickly started a group for parents of children with additional needs in the church hall with lots of toys so that people could come with their children. We've had a few homemade children come along as well.
okay.
Or, yeah, children struggling in school. So yeah, so that was partly, so I was wanting to have somewhere that children could come to as well with their parents, and their parents could, meet other parents and share experiences.
Mm,
Um, and for me as well, moving to a new place, meeting new people,
mm,
um, those are the people I had shared experiences with as well. So it's useful, sort of
mm.
helpful for me as well.
That's
Yeah.
really good. Do you mind explaining what exactly Williams syndrome is, in case
I'll
people
give it a
don't
go.
know?
I'm not good on the science and the biology. Um,
Just a
so
general overview if you want.
it's a spontaneous thing. It's the chromosomes, and he's missing a chunk of a chromosome. So
Okay.
what I can gather, when the chromosomes meet, they don't quite meet in the right way.
Oh,
Um,
okay.
so a bit gets taken off. So
Okay.
it's a little bit like Down syndrome in terms of learning profile, particularly because there's a massive range in the sort of for children who have Down syndrome in terms of their learning profile, and that's the same in the Williams syndrome learning profile as
Mm,
well. There's a Facebook group for parents of children with WS. There's probably about 700 of us in there in the UK,
okay.
and our children are very different. There are obviously some similarities, and actually, like Down syndrome, there's a facial feature. So if you met my son and then met someone else with Williams syndrome, you probably would recognise them. It's a sort of thing where it's a small community, but if you go to, I don't know, we were at the Eden Project a couple of years ago and met a family who had a child with Williams syndrome, because you can recognise your
Oh,
own child and someone else's child effectively. Um,
mm,
and sometimes on the Facebook group, people will post saying, I was at such and such today. I think I saw someone who has Williams syndrome, but I didn't want to go and ask, or I didn't get an opportunity to go and ask. Was anyone there? And sometimes you'll get someone reply saying, yes, I was there. That was me.
oh,
And it, yeah, but unless you know somebody who has Williams syndrome,
yeah.
you wouldn't notice.
Yeah.
It's just, if you're part of the community, you see your own child and someone else's.
Yeah, I'd never heard of it when we originally got in touch, and you mentioned it to me because I asked you some questions, obviously, about your journey.
Yeah.
And I'd never heard of it throughout my entire career, really, ever. How does
No,
it impact the
I
day to
hadn't.
day?
Um, so he has learning difficulties,
Uh-huh.
considerable difficulties. Um, so down to little things like, if I say to him, can you go and put this in the utility room? He doesn't remember where the utility room, doesn't know what the utility room is in terms of the label and the room.
Mhm.
He might remember if I say go to where the washing machine is.
Oh,
Um,
okay then.
People with Williams syndrome are very good at masking their difficulties.
Mm.
So language can be a challenging one because you can quite often use words and phrases and sentences in the right context.
Oh.
And then when the academics actually study it, they realise that the person with Williams syndrome has no idea what they've just said, but have somehow managed to work out how to use it correctly. So that could be tricky because he can give the appearance of understanding something that he hasn't. And there's obviously, we've got 4 boys, he's the oldest, so there's obviously the peer relationships, and having to help the other boys understand that he really does struggle with X, Y, and Z.
Mm.
And generally they're very good because they've grown up with having him struggling with different things.
Mm.
But sometimes they forget and
Mm.
have to explain. But effective, I mean, he's 11. He's been in a mainstream primary school,
Right.
but it's a very small primary school, and he's had an
Yeah.
incredible teaching assistant for the last 4 years. But he's in year 6 and he's working on reception material. So he's going to a specialist school, SEN school, in September for year 7. But
Mm.
he's enjoyed being in the mainstream for the most part, and
That's
there's
good.
only, at the moment, there's only about 60, 70 kids in the school, so
Oh
he's got
wow,
3 friends
that's so
in the school.
nice.
And yeah, so it's a really small site. Everybody knows him. He's incredibly friendly. So we had a new secretary join the office team, and I think I went in after 24 hours because I said I'm a parent governor at school, and chatted to her and sort of said, oh, you'll probably meet my oldest son quite quickly. She's like, oh, yes, I have, within an hour. He came to say hello.
Oh, that's so nice.
So yeah, so he, his father's a vicar, so vicars often stand at the end of a service. They stand at the back of the service and say goodbye to everybody. And he will often stand with him saying goodbye to people because
Oh,
he
what a
loves
nice
chatting to
tradition.
people. And I want, he's up early, up early in the mornings. So my husband sometimes does an 8 o'clock communion,
Oh,
and our oldest would go along to that with him, and he enjoys going to it because it's quiet, and
yeah.
there's some lovely people who go to it who have a lot of time for him. And so I once went because my husband wasn't doing it, but my son still wanted to go, and yeah, it felt like he was properly part of that community,
Oh,
asking him how his week had been and things like that. And he's for all the learning difficulties, he's good at remembering things, particularly injuries, because he has a lot of hospital appointments.
right.
Because WS can impact the heart and hypermobility, and he's had a lot of hospital appointments. So he's very good at asking the elderly people in our community how their hospital appointments have been, and remembering that they've had them, and which is appreciated, I think.
So
Yeah.
then, how did you come across the William Syndrome Foundation?
So I think so. His WS for him was diagnosed at 5 months because he was failure to thrive, which is a term apparently they're not meant to use, but basically a child isn't growing enough. So we were on the weekly weigh-ins with health visitors, and eventually referred to a paediatrician, and then the paediatrician found a heart murmur, so we were referred to a cardiologist, and the cardiologist had worked with people who have Williams syndrome before, and the heart murmur is something that's like classic for WS, and he spotted the facial features. So he did a genetics test, and I think he told us about the WSF
Oh, okay.
quite early on. I think he said there's a charity that supports families, so get in touch. So it's just a small, obviously because there aren't many of us, it's a small charity. It can be quite challenging because sometimes you see lots of, like the fundraising for like Down syndrome, with the odds, I think it's the odd socks thing and things like that.
Oh, yeah.
And it can be challenging as sort of being a part of a community that has very similar challenges, but doesn't have the same funding because there aren't many of us. And there's not the funding for research either, because
Oh, that's so sad.
there aren't many. So yeah, so I the Williams Syndrome Foundation, they run socials. I haven't actually been to any of them. They're often on a Sunday, which is a busy day for us. And in the pandemic, they started doing Zoom Zoom webinars with different specialists. So, like an OT who's worked with children with WS, and we'll talk about her experience and then answer questions. They had a specialist teacher from Ireland whose brother has WS, and so she has given quite a few webinars, and she's written a book as well. But we talk about her experiences with her brother, and also her teaching experiences in Ireland. So they the pandemic in a way I feel has helped, because all that technology has become common. And I joined the PAP board, forget now what it stands for. It's like an advisory board, about a year ago, I think. The CEO invited me to join. I haven't done much yet. The first meeting that I'm attending is next week, so I'll know more then. But yeah, it's because I've been obviously do a whole lot of I do research on the teaching side for WS, because I've been flexi schooling him. So on a Thursday afternoon he'll come home and have a lesson with me, because again in the pandemic, a lot of the parents in the WS community were talking about how they were finding that their children flourished with dyslexia specialist teachers. And I ended up emailing the head teacher who was in the school at the time to say, so I'm reading this, and Pitt lives with a dyslexia specialist, but he doesn't really benefit from it because after school he's tired and his brothers are tired, and at the time 2 of them were not yet in school. And so she was great. She emailed back and said, well, let's do flexi schooling. We can come home for you. We live next door to the school. Come home to you for an afternoon, and you can do one-to-one and do that. And that's been great, because he has an incredible teaching assistant, so we work together. I introduce sound, work on his reading, and then she does consolidation, and it's worked really well. I send bits and pieces into her to use if I'm using them, and yeah, it's worked really well.
That's
so I've done
good.
research on the teaching because of that, and I did so I'm a level 5 dyscalculia specialist as well. And so I did that. I did that in the pandemic. That was when it was all online with Judy Hornigold and Steve Chin, who are the 2 kind of dyscalculia experts in the country. And no, I'm sure there are others as well, but Steve Chin, they're both quite well known. And I did that over a couple of years, from sort of 2021, and used my son as my teaching practice.
Oh.
So I had to, do that. We had to do video recordings of lessons and things like that, and the feedback. So yeah, so I've been doing maths as well, which is a bit of a step out of my comfort zone.
Oh, some people just do not like that.
And again, partly because my son struggles with maths. That's a really common thing for Williams syndrome. But also, at the time, I also had a student who I was teaching. I was doing reading with her, phonics, and her mum, so it was in the pandemic, and so her mum, who was a psychologist, was noticing the difficulties she was having with maths because she was supervising the online learning with school, and said, will you do some maths with her? It's like, you know that I was an English teacher, not a maths teacher or a primary teacher. She said, yes, but we like your style of teaching, so can you do maths with her? Okay. So I started, and thought I could probably do with a qualification in this. Maybe some training. So and then saw that Judy Hornigold and Steve Chin were starting this qualification. So
I love that.
Again,
People
kind of
just hear the word teacher and they're just like, yeah, that'll do. You'll be fine. I even get people like for secondary, because I'm primary.
Yeah.
I'm like, I have no idea about the curriculum. Like, there'll be no point me teaching your child. They will not get the grade you desire at all.
I will take students for the Key Stage 1 and 2 maths curriculum, but I draw a line at anything that is on the Key Stage 3 curriculum, out of respect to my maths teacher colleagues. But equally, I have children from the age of 6 as students.
I just want to quickly go over the flexi schooling because since becoming a tutor, and obviously we'll go into that in a second, a lot of parents since lockdown have looked at other options because they've realised that their child is not happier at home or does better with a certain way of learning. And a lot of parents, from what I've read online, have really struggled to get schools to agree to flexi schooling. So, but it seems that you've had a very positive experience with the head teacher being very open and seeing the benefits of it.
I suspect she was open because of my qualifications.
Possibly.
Yeah, there was another family who had been flexi schooling at the same time, but again, that mother had experience and a track record. And there's a Facebook, I'm in a Facebook group for everything. There's a Facebook group for flexi schooling, and you do see a lot of people, especially when the child is very young, and head teachers just turn people away for flexi schooling, and I think it is at the discretion of the head teacher, possibly.
Yeah.
But no, I do have a lot of students who come to me for tuition in the daytime. I have a long waiting list for after school. And in September, I'd been receiving carers allowance, which restricts your income. You can't earn more than a certain amount a week. So it meant I could only have a couple of students. So in September, I stopped receiving carers allowance so that I could expand the tutoring business. And I was surprised at the number of students that joined me who were home educated, because I know a lot of tutors often struggle to sort of link with home educating families. But I had home educated another of my sons previously, so I'd been part of the home education community, and had probably done a fairly unschooling approach with him. So I've had a lot of families come to me who they've ended up having to withdraw their child from school completely because the school hasn't been able
on
to
the
meet
rise, isn't it? Thousands.
Yeah,
it's huge at the minute.
Yeah, there's a good number that I've met who have been traumatized It's
A
probably
lot of
the
school
most
trauma.
apt way of describing it. And it's been really interesting working with them. I really enjoy working with them. A lot of children who are autistic are struggling with school, and schools meeting their needs, because again, it goes back to this teacher education. Teachers don't understand autism beyond the stereotypical picture they have in their head. And so they don't understand masking, and they don't understand that a child who's masking in the day is like the mental effort that goes into that is incredible. We talk about the Coke bottle effect, where a child is shaken up all day and then comes home and explodes.
Mm.
And another of my children is autistic, so I've experienced that on that side. And after my son's diagnosis of autism, I was diagnosed. I did research into autism and then women in autism, and realised that okay, we're not too dissimilar. So I had a diagnosis a year or two ago, which I think hopefully helps some of my students who've also had a diagnosis, because hopefully they're able to not feel that they have to mask quite so much when they're in a lesson with me,
That's good.
because I don't I sort of I know how difficult that can be, and obviously their parents have taken them out of school because they've realised how much of a struggle it is.
So then you
Yeah.
mentioned obviously starting to tutor children with maths and things like that. When did the idea of tutoring originally come around? Like what year? How long have you been doing it so far?
So I qualified as a dyslexia specialist in 2007, I think, 2008. And I started tutoring not long after. One of my colleagues recommended me to a family, and at that point I was going around to their house and tutoring in the house.
Oh, okay.
So that was, it was 2008.
Was that
And
alongside teaching?
yeah, so that was just after school.
How did
And
you manage
then
that? Was that a lot of work?
it wasn't, because the student specifically needed support in GCSE English, so
Oh, okay.
I was teaching that anyway. But I then did, I think this is while the Labour government was still there. There was funding for, I don't know, it was catch-up funding for year 7s and 8s.
Okay.
And I think it's like £25 an hour. And the school was given a certain amount of funding for a certain amount of students. And then one of my colleagues in English was given the responsibility of organising it. And so she had teachers from across the subjects. Maths had the same thing. So she had teachers from wherever in the school who could help the students with literacy skills. Wasn't really much training given for it. And we were in the classroom next door and got on very well. She was my line manager effectively for all the CPD stuff. So she gave me 3 or 4 students for after school tutoring who were either diagnosed as being dyslexic or we thought were likely to be dyslexic. So I worked with them. I think I'd around about 4 students. So yeah, it would have been 1 student after school each day that I was working with. That was for a couple of years, I think, when we had that funding. So I was doing that, and then I joined, I don't know if you've come across PATOS. It's one of the professional bodies for dyslexia specialists. And
Okay.
PATOS have, so they have a directory of tutors, and if you're looking for a private assessment, the advice is to go on the PATOS website and find an assessor and so forth. But they also run local groups for teachers. So a certain number of times a year, they might run training with people in, with different areas. I remember Steve Chin came to the Gloucestershire one at one point, the guy who did the dyscalculia stuff. The Bucks Patos group last year had someone called Tracy Packerman, who's a specialist in working memory. She's in America, but because of technology and the pandemic, we were able, they had her speaking. She's brilliant. So one of the people who I had trained with on the dyslexia course wanted to set up a local patos group because there wasn't one. So I was involved in the initial committee for setting up that patos group. And out of that, one of the other people who was on the committee ran a local company for study skills. And so I also started doing some tutoring for her with university students. And I think I had another student after school as well who lived around
And
the
this
corner.
was all with teaching as well, still?
Yeah, this is all with teaching. Yeah.
All right. And then how did you progress away from, what made you decide to think, are you still teaching? No, you're not still teaching now, that's not right. But how did you decide to suddenly, right, I'm going to turn this into a full-time thing?
So while all this was going on, my husband was going through the process of thinking of becoming a vicar.
Right.
And I was also reaching 30. So thinking about having children. And so I was aware from the dyslexia qualifications and from the bits of tutoring that I'd done that most of the support for dyslexic students came through tuition. And so the sort of the thing in the back of my mind was this is a possibility in the future, as a way of being able to relocate with his job if need be, because you have to live in the vicarage. And sort of the circumstances with my son being diagnosed. And I when I first got the job at the Saturday school, I sort of had a little interview with the person who ran it in Oxford, and she actually said at that interview, oh, I reckon in about 10 years you could be running a tuition company. And in her mind, I was going to be doing face-to-face in a setup similar to what she was doing. This was through the British Dyslexia Association, but she was like, you could do this and that. Okay, yeah, maybe. Saturdays don't work because vicars have weddings on Saturdays, so I can't do Saturdays, but got the children to look after. But yeah, so she probably put a seed in my mind. But and I joined Facebook groups for everything. So when tutoring groups come up, I joined them. So I started to see what other people were doing and how they were working. And originally I was face to face. So I had 2 or 3 students face to face before the pandemic, keeping it within my carers allowance restrictions. And then of course I was forced to go online with the pandemic. I'd always been thinking about it, but we live in a village, it's rural, and I wasn't convinced the internet would work. And so the families had been coming to my house. We went online, and none of them asked to go back to face.
Oh, wow.
It worked, and I guess I can hear parents making tea, clanging pans in the background. And one student, a home ed student, was travelling maybe 20-30 minutes to get to me. So for his mum, it was more straightforward to carry on online. I assume we've never even discussed going back to face to face. I had another student, he's in the village next to me, but she stayed online as well. And she came to me briefly face to face actually, because she was home educated for a while. So when she was home educated, she came to me in the pandemic. We sat in the garden, how many meters apart, whatever it was. So yes, I suppose she did come back briefly. But once she was back in school, she went back online. And yes, it kind of grew from there. And the online has worked really well for me. And I think it works well for lots of neurodivergent students, because it means that they're not having to go into someone else's space, different smells, different sounds, different stuff. And it also means that they don't have someone coming into their space with different smells and things like that. And I think sometimes I have sort of smell sensitivities. So if we have visitors in the house who have strong perfumes, the windows will be open as soon as they leave the house. And so for a child having a tutor coming in with perfumes or anything, just different smells or just invading their space, it can be quite challenging. So being online just means they can be in, you know, whatever space they want. I encourage parents to participate in the lessons. It started a while ago with one of my earlier students who at the time the student had difficulties with hearing, and his mum, who's a teacher, suggested that she might act as a TA to him. And she participates fully in the lesson. And it's great. I've been with them, I think they've been with me for 3 or 4 years. And I look forward to their lessons. I enjoy working with them.
Aww.
And so after working with her, I now encourage as many parents as possible to not just to be present, but to participate as well if they want. So this mum, when I play games, he plays against her rather than against me. And I just
That's
scribe for the
really
game.
good, because that builds up then the relationship aspect.
Yeah, and
Teamwork.
for families who are home educating as well, I mean, I'm doing 45 minutes of teaching, they're doing the entire week. So they need the teaching that I do to be valuable and worthwhile, and also to springboard into what they might be doing.
Yeah.
So there's one mum I work with, I teach sort of her daughter the history of English, so history of language, which is one of my absolute joys. I love doing language history, and so we'll talk about different things, and her mum will keep a little notebook of things to like research and look into over the week while we're chatting through different things. And again, it you know, if I'm working on, as I've got in front of me now, looks like this is one for for next week. So art as in quad or squabble. It means that the parents have been part of that lesson, and they can then bring it into the learning as they're out and about doing different things, if they've, you know, been doing it with them. And so the student who I first started having mum involved, he uses window pens, which quite a few of my students do. So when they're doing spelling practice, they'll write on the windows, and then the families leave the spellings up for the rest of the week. More often than not, it's just because they forget to clean the windows, I think. But again, it's in the kitchens, so they can get them to
I like that
practice
idea,
spellings over
window
the week.
pens.
Yeah, it came from when I trained. Crayola make them, and I had one of the, like, a terrapin classroom. It was meant to be a temporary classroom, but it was it'd been there for 20 years. So the students that I had after school for this random funding, we used to write all over the windows, or we'd write on the pavements outside with chalk. I think the site staff really appreciated that. And so last week, when the weather was really hot, one of the mums that I work with, she took the laptop down into the garden, and we were having her sons do like running races and things with the reading. But she also had chalks out, and so had it set up so that I could see the student practicing the spellings with his chalks.
Wow. I love that. That's really cool.
So try to go to as multi-sensory as possible. So I kind
Yeah.
of try to replicate the multi-sensory teaching that we're trained to do as dyslexia specialists through the computer, which can sometimes be a bit tricky. So a lot of my students have like Lego letters. So if we're doing spellings,
Oh, yes.
they make the word using I'm going to show you just random letters, but they'll make the word using Lego letters.
Oh, they're very good.
And I do the same thing on the other side. We sometimes compete to make them and that sort of thing. And it helps with sort of the multisensory side. One of the students who I had as a face-to-face student, and so he's been with me for 5 years. He home ed student, so he's very independent, and he made some sensory, I think it was rice or salt, I'm not sure, I sent the recipe over. Made some sensory salt, and he would have the salt or rice in front of him, and he would write the words in the
Oh, yeah. That's good for early years. That's what we used to do all the
yeah.
time.
So we still use it as a dyslexia specialist. You know, you can have the smell and, you know, different smells or whatever if you want. And he was doing that for a while, and then he needed to change it, so he got rid of it, and then never got around to making any more. and he went back to using the Legos and noticed that for him his spelling's improved using the Lego. So he's like, I really want to use the salt or rice if I ever get around to doing it, but the Lego is better for me.
Oh.
So he hasn't made it now. He's sticking with the rice. But yeah, like the window pens have worked really well. And I've got one student who writes on, like, like the rainbow paper that you scratch
Don't know that
scratch
one.
words.
Oh, yes, I do. Sorry. Yes,
Yeah.
yes.
I'm just saying I've got something from her lesson there. Yeah, she's taken to doing that.
Oh.
Her lesson we
Do they
changed that.
buy it on their own accord, or do you recommend it?
I quite often WhatsApp Amazon links. If
Oh.
there's a resource that we're talking about that might work and the parents get it. This one, she happened to have some on the table in a lesson. I was like, can we do that? Can we do this? And I was like, yeah, let's go for it. Yeah, the parents. I have a thing on a list on my website of, it'll be worth having this and this available as part of the lesson. I read with a lot of students. I read a book at the end of the lesson as well, so maybe the last five minutes or so. And I grade books on my website. So there was a dyslexia researcher called Peter Hatcher who worked at the University of York with a team of specialists, and he did a research study in Cumbria looking at developing phonemic awareness amongst dyslexics, and he developed a program called Sound Linkage, which is kind of a classic in the dyslexia specialist community. And with that, he introduced book grading, where, because you'll probably know from your early years experience, that if you look at the red band, the books are so different within that same band. The sentence structures, the vocabulary, the sounds that are being used, they can be wildly different in terms of the skills the students need to be able to read them. And so he developed a finer grading system. So within the red band, we might have maybe 10 to 15 grades. And so it means that a child can learn to read incrementally. So I came across it when I was training, but then came across this again because the Down syndrome education group had started to work with the York group, and they had developed a resource to use with children who have Down syndrome, and the book grading that Peter Hatcher developed is part of that. So I started to look into the Down syndrome resource, which is called RLI, because of my son, and looking for a strategy to teach him to read. And we often borrow things from the Down syndrome community. So I trained as a tutor to use that program, to use RLI. And then I did the subsequent training so that I can train other tutors to use that program. So I started grading books as part of that. And I was using them with my oldest son, who has Williams syndrome. And he still uses them. I send piles of graded books into his teaching assistant, and she works through the grading books, and she's done the training as well as a tutor. But at the same time, I was home educating my second child. And so he learned to read using the graded books. And it's great for the self-esteem as well, because, you say I'm on level 15. Whereas you might be on red in school. So he learnt with this incremental system, and the idea from Peter Hatcher is that you only present a child a book that they might have 90%, 97% fluency with. So there's only 3% of the book that they might struggle with, that might be new. So my second son learnt to read with this grading as well. He has a diagnosis of dyslexia, but he's a very enthusiastic reader. He'll read for a couple of hours a night. He was very pleased to tell me last year that when he was in year 4, that some of the books he was reading were in the year 5-6 classroom on their recommended reading list. And so he loves reading despite having difficulties with dyslexia. So I think that system worked for him. And so sort of a year or so ago, I realised that I've got this massive pile of graded books, because I had started grading novels as well, because I realised that for my students, being able to say, right, we've just finished this book, how about you look on my website and there's 5 books that I've graded in the next sort of couple of gradings. So they'll be a tiny bit more difficult, but not drastically more difficult. And so that's how I do the reading with my students, work out which grade they're on, and then we look at the books that they might want to read. The charity shop near me sells books for really low prices, and they know me really well now. Walk out with 10 books to take home and grade, like £4. And so when I have time, I haven't uploaded many recently, but I upload the books onto the website, and then my students can go, you know, right, you're on grade 50, so go to 50 and choose a book from there, and then we'll read that in our lessons. So that works well. I can't
That's
remember
really
how I got that though. But yeah.
Lovely. Well, it's been lovely chatting to you. Now, before we finish, let's just talk about what you currently offer and where people can find you online.
So I am offering tuition mostly daytimes at the moment. My after schools are generally full. So first again. Yeah, so daytime tuition primarily. So I work with students who are dyslexic, students who are autistic, ADHD, no diagnosis at all, but maybe have struggled in school or school trauma. A lot of students I work with in a classic dyslexia specialist way, and I teach them to read. Some students who maybe are strong readers or have become strong readers, I move on to working on etymology and morphology with them. So we might look at a root word like scent, and then look at the words that come from that, and sort of to improve their vocabulary, because I find a lot of dyslexic learners have struggled so much with learning to read that they've often not been able to absorb the vocabulary. And so they might be able to read the word and be able to decode it, because the phonics teaching in our schools these days is pretty strong. But they've had to put so much effort into decoding, they haven't the foggiest clue what the word actually means. And so I do a lot of work with some students on that side. I also teach bits of history and English and things like that, and then maths as well, and find different ways to get into different subjects with students. Sometimes a more traditional teaching approach doesn't always work. I've had some students who teach me things. So one student had been teaching me some of her craft projects, because that's a word, just in terms of like forming a relationship and allowing the student to have confidence in something. So yeah, so I've got a couple of sort of vacancies for September for daytime tuition. Mondays and Wednesdays, I think. So there's a couple around lunchtime that are free. And yeah,
Where
you can
can
find
we
me
find you?
So on my website, there's a page called Get in Touch. So it's greatexpectationseducation.uk. And there's a Get in Touch page, and there's a little form to fill out. And then I send people a link for a little Zoom chat. And we meet online, the parent and I, the student, if the parent thinks that would be useful, to sort of see whether my teaching approach would work for their child and for how they learn, and then we go from there. My Facebook page is also Great Expectations Education. and it's variably active. So I try to post what I can. What I'm hoping to do is to post a lot of the multisensory ideas on my Facebook page over the next couple of months. I've been meaning to do this for a whole year. Of things you can do at home with your child, because I'm also going to be uploading some of the resources that I've made onto my website, because obviously tuition is expensive, and where families have had to take their child out of school because the child is struggling, family finances are going to be tight because a parent may have had to adjust their working hours to accommodate that when it wasn't their original intention. And so through talking to some of my students and their parents, I've realised that having some resources available online on a website might be useful. So I'm going to be, because I've made them for my son, they're just sat there and I don't use a lot of them because they're for face-to-face teaching. So I'm going to make those available for sort of low cost. And also, again, through talking to another client recently, I may be offering a sort of a WhatsApp consultation service, so that parents who need a more adaptive sort of tuition service, especially for some students who can't access online tuition as well. I have quite a few parents who come to me who can't, that their students just not going to be able to sort of participate in an online session. But a WhatsApp service would mean they can come to me with, we've got to this and I don't know what to do next. Maybe, you know, for a small subscription. So that's possibly in the works. And I also offer parent consultations as well. So an hour chatting through whatever the parent wants to talk about, really. So some parents, we've talked through the HCP process, how to apply for it. Other parents, their child might not be eligible for an EHCP, but they still should be given reasonable adjustments in school, and the school may well not be giving those to them. So things like directing them to the legal documents that they need to quote to get that in school, or other parents might be teaching at home through home education and just want to run ideas past somebody else and get ideas and just throw ideas around. And I have had a few occasions where somebody just needs to talk, doesn't necessarily need like a to-do list at the end, but just need some reassurance. So that's also on my website as well.
That's great.
It's a collection of things
It's
and the
so
book gradings
amazing.
and other bits. So it's all sort of like, it's one of those like lots of ideas and trying to bring them all into one thing. So yeah.
Well, thank you very much. It's been really
Thank
interesting
you.
chatting to you, and I'll leave all your information down below. If you
Brilliant.
liked today's video, please make sure to subscribe to see who else I'm chatting to, and make sure to check out all of the details down below. Thank you so much, and thank you for watching.